Now, the differences between these river valleys is one factor in explaining the differences between Egypt and Mesopotamia. A second factor is the vulnerability of Mesopotamia to invasion. Mesopotamia can be invaded from almost any direction. That is, modern Iraq can be invaded. Egypt is relatively safe in that way. It's very hard to take over. And as I've mentioned in an earlier lecture, even when foreigners managed to come into Egypt, the vastness of the project of conquest meant that they were eventually subsumed into Egyptian culture. Think of Cleopatra and her relationship with Rome, and how Rome in Egypt becomes, in a way, Egyptianized. So we have the idea that Iraq, Mesopotamia is vulnerable, and that Egypt is relatively invulnerable. Historians and theorists of history like to speak of Egypt as a kind of optimistic culture. It's a culture that felt secure. It couldn't be overrun. The succession of Mesopotamian cultures are thought of as more pessimistic, and we will see throughout our course how this is reflected in myth. It's a generalization, but it's a valuable one, like many generalizations. Egypt was very wealthy. Well, this could make you optimistic, couldn't it? If you were very wealthy. It had access to mineral wealth, and especially to gold, to the gold of Nubia, which means, in ancient Egyptian, the land of gold. Mesopotamia was not rich in minerals. It had to go to other lands to find minerals, and we will study this later in some of the mythic material. So, optimism in Egypt, pessimism in Mesopotamia. Another way of speaking about it is Egypt as closed. Well, this doesn't go along with optimism, but let me show you what I mean. Closed in the sense of complete. Egypt's self-understanding as a culture, here I'm speaking of the ancient Egyptian civilization, was that in the beginning of time, ancient Egyptian culture achieved a perfection in writing, in religion, in ritual, and in architecture. Think of the vast, great building projects. This perfection was a gift of the gods. Humanity, in its nature, can only descend from that perfection. Things were going to get worse. This, of course, is an easy prediction to make, as all cynics know, because things generally do get worse. But the Egyptians had this idea of early perfection and later degeneration. So their ideal was a complete and closed system. And this went along with their complete and closed physical geography. Yes, there was outside influence, but it could be limited. Mesopotamian cultures can be seen as more open to outside influence, sometimes by volition and sometimes against their will. That is, they were conquered by other peoples. And this also relates to cultural artifacts. Writing. Egypt used the hieroglyphic system in its various scripts, or its basic variation of hieroglyphic writing, for 3,000 years of history. Other cultures did not adopt Egyptian language and writing. It stayed within Egypt. The situation in Mesopotamia is very different. Other cultures use Mesopotamian cuneiform and write their own language in it. So again, the closed Egyptian culture, the open Mesopotamian culture. The optimistic Egyptian culture, the pessimistic Mesopotamian culture. The first great civilization of ancient Iraq, ancient Mesopotamia, was that of the Sumerians of southern Iraq. Their ethnic origins and the origins of their language remain a mystery. I've mentioned that this date of 3000 BC is when we can count the beginning of the writing systems and urban culture. In 3000 BC, there were some 10 of these emerging city-states. Later, the number would move as high as 25 or 30, that is, centuries later. Among them were cities later made famous through archaeology: Ur, Uruk, Nippur, Lagash, and others. Many of these cities were walled, and outside of the walls were the lands where food was produced for the city dwellers. This harkens back to our surplus of wealth theory. In the early third millennium, that is, between 3000 BC and 2600 BC, Ur was among the most powerful cities, and we'll see this reflected in myth. And about 2600 BC, power shifted to Uruk under the rule of the great king Gilgamesh, hero of the epic. And in an earlier lecture, I spoke of the transformation of this historical personage into a mythic personage. In the second half of the third millennium, from 2400 BC on, the Semitic-speaking people to the north and west of Sumer, the Acadians, gained ascendancy over most of Iraq and absorbed Sumerian culture and religion, achieving a new cultural synthesis. The ruler associated with this conquest was Sargon of Akkad. That's about 2300 BC. And he too will become a figure of myth. So we have these two kings, Gilgamesh of Uruk, Sargon of Akkad, who were historical personages. We know of this from the archaeological record, but who soon became the subject of mythic tales. The Sumerians had very clear ideas about the importance of order and organization. One of their origin myths, titled Enki and the World Order, tells of the god Enki, E-N-K-I, who's the inventor and administrator god. This is a function that I think many groups, schools, and corporations would like to benefit from. That is, they might theologize this and say, we need an administrator god. Because in the Sumerian idea of religion, with its many gods, gods had functions. There was a creator god in many of the myths, but Enki was not one of these creator gods. He was the god who took what was created and he organized this. He did this both on the macro level and on the micro level. He organized both the physical, natural world, rivers and valleys, so that they could produce food, and the urban world, constructing the first cities. He organized physical reality into efficient categories. And when it came to humans, humans were created, according to the Sumerian myths, by some very strange devices, which we'll speak about later. Once they were created, their functions were assigned by divine order. And here I want to alert you to a similarity to things Egyptian. In Mesopotamia, in Sumeria particularly, we have a similar idea about the origins of culture, that the gods designate how things are organized and how humans should organize their activities. Very different than our Western idea of progress. Things are getting better. Things are getting more organized. Research the future will make life easier. This is a forward-looking idea. Notice the backward-looking idea, not backward, but backward-looking idea that says things were perfect once and we need to maintain stability. So stability is a key idea here. This god, Enki, blessed the great city of Ur in Sumer. Ur, you are supplied with much water. May your divine laws be well directed. City whose fates have been directed by Enki, Ur, may you rise to heaven's heights. And throughout this series, we will see that the city of Ur, blessed by the gods, is going to figure in Sumerian and later mythologies. And I will remind you, it also figures in the controversy, a controversy we've referred to, about the Bible and ancient Near Eastern civilization. Because Ur is the city where Abraham's family comes from, according to the narrative in the book of Genesis. So here we find ancient Near Eastern references to Ur, and we find biblical references to Ur. Enki is the god who brings writing to humans, and writing enables organization. Without writing, the Sumerians and later Mesopotamians felt one could not have a stable society. And they tell many wonderful stories about how writing evolves. Now here too, to compare Egypt and Mesopotamia, they both had this divine notion of writing. In Egypt, the scribe god Thoth was the origin of all writing. In Mesopotamia, early Sumer, Enki was the origin of writing. So writing, along with the other arts, had to be delivered. Therefore, writing itself and the system of writing represented an idea of perfection.